Make no mistake, Vladimir Putin is now afraid. May 1st, 2026. The scaling down of the May 9th Victory Day parade in Red Square is extraordinary. So much so that it demands serious attention. What was once a massive display of military power now appears reduced to something closer to a token event. This, remember, is meant to honor the sacrifice of some 26 million Russians during what they called the Great Patriotic War, known elsewhere as the Second World War. To cut it back so dramatically, reportedly due to an inability to defend Moscow from Ukrainian attack, is not just embarrassing, it is strategically revealing. For Vladimir Putin, it raises uncomfortable questions. This is in part because when Putin reintroduced military hardware to the parade in 2008, he framed it as a clear signal of strength, a warning to adversaries that Russia could defend itself. He was explicit. This was not saber-rattling, but proof of growing capability. That claim now rings hollow. There are two key issues here. First, the war in Ukraine is not going Russia's way. Russian forces are losing ground and are suffering casualties at an unsustainable rate. Replacements, poorly trained and reportedly including ethnic Russian conscripts who are not supposed to be sent beyond Russia's borders, are being fed into the fight with little effect beyond inflating losses. This reality is no longer contained. Knowledge of it is filtering back into Russia and fueling discontent. Second, Ukraine has shifted the battle space. This is no longer a conflict confined to the front lines. Ukrainian strikes are reaching deep into Russian territory at ranges up to 932 miles, targeting critical infrastructure. There are credible reports of significant damage to Russia's oil production and key air defense assets. Moscow appears unable to stop these attacks and the economic consequences are beginning to bite. Against that backdrop, the reduced parade becomes more than symbolism. It is an admission of decline. Even after redeploying advanced air defense assets like the S-400 missile system away from the front lines, the Kremlin cannot guarantee the security of its own capital. Nor does Russia appear to have sufficient modern armor left to present a convincing show of strength. The museum pieces now in service would be an embarrassment. The decision to proceed with foreign guests and civilians in attendance while limiting military display is telling. It speaks volumes to priorities and vulnerabilities in Putin's disregard for his allies and his people. Discontent is no longer confined to fringe voices. Military bloggers and even senior military officers are increasingly vocal in their criticism of how the war is being conducted, and a major crackdown on social media and other independent internet platforms is underway. Contrast that with Ukraine's position. Under Wladimir Zelensky, Kyiv projects confidence, striking targets deep inside Russia while expanding its domestic production of drones and missiles. Ukraine is not just fighting the war. It is shaping the future battle space and building an industrial base that will outlast the conflict. Its experts are now in the Middle East advising and offering hardware to protect against Iranian drones and missiles. This is a smart move and will help fund the rebuilding of Ukraine after the war. The strategic picture is shifting. For Putin, the options are narrowing. A ceasefire and a negotiated settlement may now represent his least worst outcome. But that will require pressure, particularly from European NATO members, applied with clarity and resolve. And just perhaps, King Charles III on his barnstorming trip to the US has managed to talk some sense into Donald Trump on Ukraine. If so, that might also help to bring the dictator in the Kremlin to the table for real. Ukraine's allies must help Kiev exploit this promising but probably fleeting opportunity. By The Telegraph, story by Hamish de Breton Gordon, May 1st, 2026.
You know, when you think about how a global superpower projects its strengths, there's a very specific visual language we've all been kind of conditioned to expect.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the language of just overwhelming scale. You picture these massive stone buildings, soaring monuments, and just, endless rows of heavy machinery rolling down grand avenues.
Like classic parade footage.
Exactly. It's built to look immovable, right? It's supposed to be overwhelming by design.
Well, yeah, because it functions as a form of geopolitical fiat currency. That whole projection of power relies entirely on perceived value and unquestioned belief. Like, as long as everyone looking at the structure believes it's impenetrable, the deterrence holds.
Right, but military posturing only works until it's actually tested. What happens when you lean against one of those massive imposing pillars of power and it suddenly sounds hollow?
That's when things get dangerous.
It's exactly like a run on a bank. I mean, the moment a financial institution admits it doesn't have the cash in the vault to cover deposits, the panic becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I know. It totally spirals.
The illusion of invincibility shatters, and suddenly, everyone is looking for the structural cracks.
Which fundamentally changes the calculus for every other nation on the board. You stop looking at the facade and you start examining the foundation.
And finding those structural cracks is exactly what we're doing today. Welcome back to another deep dive. Today we've got a really fascinating stack of source material for you.
Oh, it's a great one today.
Yeah, it centers around this sharp piece of geopolitical analysis published in The Telegraph on May 1st, 2026. It was written by Hamish de Breton Gordon.
And it really offers a masterclass in reading between the lines of global events, stripping away the propaganda to look at the mechanical realities of the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Exactly. Our mission for you today is to decode how a single, scaled-down event in Moscow serves as a massive strategic tell. We're going to pull back the curtain on the shifting battlefields, the collapsing supply chains, and, the high-stakes global politics surrounding all of it.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
Okay, let's unpack this. But before we dive into the mechanics, we do have a quick piece of housekeeping.
Right. This is a really vital piece of context for how we approach this material.
Yeah, so the source text we're examining today contains some pretty politically charged commentary. It mentions specific real-world political figures and, foreign policy strategies. We want to be crystal clear with you, the listener. Our goal in this deep dive is to neutrally report and analyze the geopolitical hypothesis presented in the specific Telegraph article.
Yeah, we're absolutely not endorsing any political viewpoints, any candidates, royal figures, or taking any sides in the conflict.
None of that.
We're simply acting as your analytical guides through the logic and the arguments the author has laid out, just looking at the mechanics of his argument.
Exactly. So diving into that logic, the material anchors us immediately to the most visible sign of structural decay in Russia right now, the May 9th Victory Day parade in Red Square.
Right.
Culturally, this is sacred ground. It honors the sacrifice of roughly 26 million Russians who died during the Great Patriotic War, which, the rest of the world knows as the Second World War.
The historical weight of that day just cannot be overstated. But the modern application of the parade, it's entirely strategic.
How so?
Well, back in 2008, Vladimir Putin explicitly reintroduced heavy military hardware to this event. He didn't frame it as just mere nostalgia. He framed it as a doctrine of modern deterrence.
Okay.
It was a highly calculated signal to global adversaries that Russia possessed the hardware and, importantly, the logistical capability to defend its borders and project power outward.
Which makes the reality of the 2026 parade so jarring, right? Because that massive ground-shaking display of armor and ballistic missiles has been reduced to a token event.
Yeah, it's a shadow of its former self.
And we aren't just talking about a slight budgetary scale back here. The author reports that this dramatic reduction is driven by a stark tactical reality, like an actual inability to physically defend the airspace over Moscow from Ukrainian attacks.
What's fascinating here is that this is the geopolitical equivalent of the bank admitting the vault is empty.
Yeah.
It's just a staggering admission of vulnerability. When a nation that has spent 2 decades building its identity around military modernization,
Right.
when they cannot secure the sky over their own capital for their most sacred national holiday, the deterrence doctrine completely unravels.
You simply cannot project power globally if you look vulnerable locally.
Exactly.
Think of a neighbor who constantly brags about their wealth, right? And they throw this massive, lavish block party every single year just to show off.
I think we all know someone like that.
Right. But suddenly this year you show up and they're only serving tap water and saltines. It's not just embarrassing, it makes you wonder what's going on with their bank account.
It raises immediate red flags. And yet, they decided to proceed with the parade anyway.
Right.
They invited foreign guests, they brought out civilians, and held the ceremony while actively limiting the military display that usually provides the protective posture.
Which just speaks volumes about the internal panic. I mean, it highlights a blatant disregard for the physical safety of those dignitaries and the civilian population, purely to maintain a hollow shell of tradition.
It really reveals a leadership structure that is prioritizing political optics over actual security.
Yeah.
Because if you cannot guarantee that airspace, putting allied dignitaries out in the open is an unacceptable risk. It's a desperate attempt to just paper over a massive capability gap.
Which naturally leads to the question, where did all that military hardware go?
Right.
If the tanks and the advanced anti-aircraft systems aren't in Red Square projecting power, they should be on the front lines executing it. But the source material details a military apparatus that is bleeding out.
And that's putting it mildly.
Russian forces are losing ground, and they are suffering casualties at a rate that is mathematically unsustainable.
And this is where we have to look at the mechanisms of how a military fills those massive gaps in manpower. Because when the professional contractual army is decimated, a state has to turn to conscription. But the composition of those replacements is igniting a massive internal crisis. The analysis notes that Russia is feeding poorly trained replacements into the fight, heavily relying on ethnic Russian conscripts from the outer republics.
Let's drill into the historical and legal context of that, because it's not just a random personnel shift. Historically, the Kremlin has maintained a very delicate social contract to keep domestic stability intact.
Very delicate.
The unwritten rule was always that the urban elites in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg would be largely insulated from the brutal realities of war.
Right. While the heavy burden of combat fell disproportionately on rural and ethnic minority populations.
Yes, and furthermore, there are legal frameworks within Russia that technically prohibit sending standard conscripts beyond the borders of the Russian Federation into active foreign combat zones.
Oh, really? So they aren't even supposed to be there legally?
Correct. By utilizing these specific conscripts to plug the holes in the front line, the state is not just violating its own military laws, it is fundamentally breaking that fragile social contract.
But wait, if that's true, then how is the public finding out?
Well,
because if the Russian state operates this vast, highly sophisticated domestic propaganda machine, I mean, if they control the television networks and tightly monitor internet traffic, shouldn't they be able to obfuscate these battlefield losses?
you'd think so.
Yeah, like, shouldn't they be able to keep the reality of this conscription from reaching the general public? You would assume the state media bubble could contain it, but the mechanisms of information control are fracturing. The dam is breaking because the volume of the losses is simply too massive to hide.
Wow.
When that many body bags return to those rural republics, word of mouth totally bypasses the state broadcasters. Furthermore, the reality of the front line is bleeding back into Russia through the very platforms the military relies on for communication.
Oh, you mean like Telegram channels, military bloggers, those kind of decentralized networks?
Precisely. It's fueling serious, palpable discontent. We are no longer just seeing whispers among ordinary citizens or, fringe anti-war activists.
Right.
The analysis points out that prominent military bloggers and incredibly senior military officers are becoming highly vocal in their criticism of how the Kremlin is conducting the war.
I mean, having active or recently retired senior military officers openly criticizing the Kremlin's strategic competence is a massive institutional shift. That is the pillar wobbling.
It threatens the entire command structure. And we know how dangerous the Kremlin views this internal dissent because of their reaction to it.
The internet crackdown.
Exactly. A draconian crackdown on social media and independent internet platforms is underway. A state doesn't expend that much capital cracking down on independent internet platforms unless it is terrified of the political awakening happening within its own borders.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the public isn't just getting angry about rumors from a distant front line. The physical reality of the war has fundamentally inverted.
Yeah, this is a huge shift.
The conflict is no longer confined to the trenches and artillery fields of eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian strikes are now reaching deep into Russian territory. We're talking about confirmed operational ranges of up to 932 miles.
Which is astounding. To understand the gravity of that, we really have to look at the logistical nightmare it creates for Moscow. 932 miles is not a localized border skirmish.
Not at all.
Achieving that kind of reach requires immense technological capability, sophisticated drone manufacturing, and incredibly precise satellite coordination to bypass radar nets.
It's like a boxer who stepped into the ring expecting a standard fight, only to realize their opponent has slipped out of the ring and is now dismantling the boxer's training camp and bank accounts back home.
That's a perfect analogy.
And if you're listening to this and you follow global energy markets, this is the exact metric you need to be tracking. Because these deep strikes are not random acts of harassment.
No, they're highly targeted.
Ukraine is systematically targeting critical infrastructure, specifically oil production facilities and refineries. This isn't just kinetic military damage, it's a direct, calculated hit on the economic engine that funds the Russian war machine.
And that's exactly why the economic consequences are beginning to bite so severely. But honestly, the tactical consequences might be even worse. Moscow appears entirely unable to intercept these deep penetration drone attacks. The panic has reached a point where the Kremlin has been forced to redeploy their most advanced air defense assets.
Wait, really?
Yeah, specifically the highly touted S-400 missile systems. They're pulling them away from the active battle space to protect the capital.
Wow. Let's break down the mechanics of the S-400, because moving it isn't just about repositioning a single vehicle, right?
Not at all.
The S-400 is an integrated radar and command system designed to create a massive anti-access area denial bubble, what military strategists call an A2AD zone.
Exactly. When that system is positioned near the front lines, it creates a dome that blinds and paralyzes enemy aviation and long-range strike capabilities over the active battle space. It provides the necessary cover for ground troops to actually maneuver.
So the moment you pack up that massive logistical footprint and move it hundreds of miles backward to protect political buildings in Moscow, you are essentially popping that protective bubble over your forward operating bases.
You're leaving them totally exposed.
You're leaving your frontline troops and supply depots completely naked to Ukrainian aviation. They are actively trading the tactical viability of their offensive line just to keep the roof over the Kremlin intact.
It is a cascading failure of military resource allocation. And the crazy thing is, even with those advanced systems pulled back to the capital, the source notes that the Kremlin still cannot guarantee the security of its own airspace.
Which brings us back to the missing tanks at the Victory Day parade.
Right.
The author's assessment of the remaining Russian inventory is brutal. The armor left in service is described as, quote, museum pieces. That would be an absolute embarrassment to display in Red Square.
Yeah, when you spend 20 years threatening your neighbors with the promise of a modernized, high-tech military, you cannot roll out a T-62 tank from the 1960s and expect the deterrence to hold.
No, you really can't.
It completely evaporates the psychological advantage Putin established back in 2008.
So if we look at the board right now, we have Russia pulling out Cold War relics, suffering mathematically unsustainable troop losses, popping their own air defense bubbles, and aggressively censoring their panicking population.
It's a bleak picture for them.
And to really grasp the gravity of this shift, we have to look at the exact opposite trajectory happening in Kiev, because the contrast the author draws between the two nations is just staggering.
It's a study in completely divergent strategic evolution.
Under President Volodymyr Zelensky, the analysis notes that Kyiv is projecting an entirely different kind of confidence. They aren't just holding the line or relying purely on the influx of donated Western equipment anymore.
No, they're building their own.
Exactly. They are actively expanding their own domestic defense industrial base, specifically in the massive production of autonomous drones and missile technology.
They're transitioning from playing purely defensive survival tactics to actively shaping the future battle space on their own terms.
And there's one specific detail in the source material that really highlights this evolution. It reports that Ukrainian military and technical experts are currently on the ground in the Middle East.
Yes, this part is wild.
They're advising foreign governments and actively offering their domestically produced hardware to help protect against Iranian-manufactured drones and missiles.
It's an incredibly sophisticated geopolitical maneuver.
But I mean, so they're exporting defense tech and personnel to the Middle East mid-war. Initially, if you just glance at that, it sounds like a massive misallocation of resources.
It does sound counterintuitive at first.
Right. Like, if you are fighting an existential war for your own survival, shouldn't every single engineer, every single drone, and every ounce of strategic focus be kept strictly within your own borders? Like, how does sending defense experts to the Middle East help Ukraine win a war inside its own borders?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a brilliant long-term strategy. The leadership in Kyiv understands that this kinetic war will eventually reach a negotiated end. And when the guns stop firing, Ukraine will be left with a shattered civilian infrastructure that requires an unprecedented financial investment to rebuild.
Oh, wow. I see where this is going.
Right. The author argues that Ukraine is not just fighting today's war. They're using the crucible of this conflict to forge an industrial base meant to outlast it.
So they're essentially turning the current battlefield into the ultimate proof of concept for their autonomous technology.
Precisely. They're demonstrating to the world that their hardware can defeat Russian and Iranian systems in the most brutal electronic warfare-heavy testing ground on Earth.
Yeah.
By pivoting to sell this battle-hardened technology and their unmatched recent combat expertise to regions like the Middle East, they're actively creating a massive independent revenue stream.
That is incredibly smart.
The source explicitly frames this as a proactive move to secure the immense funding required for the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, without relying solely on Western charity.
They're future-proofing their sovereign economy by pivoting into a major defense exporter while the war is still happening. That is like playing a multi-decade chess game while simultaneously fighting a daily street brawl. It's remarkable.
It really is.
So what does this all mean for the immediate future of the conflict? I mean, we have a former superpower backed into a corner, hiding behind museum pieces and internet censorship, while the nation they invaded is forging global alliances and building a post-war industrial complex. How does this tension actually resolve?
The author's conclusion is that the strategic window is shifting rapidly, and for Vladimir Putin, the options are severely, dangerously narrowing.
The text actually goes so far as to state that Putin is now afraid.
Yes, and a cornered, fearful adversary with a degrading military is a highly volatile variable.
Definitely.
Because of those narrowing options, the author suggests that securing a ceasefire and forcing a negotiated settlement might now represent Putin's least worst outcome. He lacks the structural capability to achieve his initial maximalist goals, but he desperately needs to freeze the conflict to survive politically.
But the Kremlin isn't just going to voluntarily walk to the negotiating table out of good faith.
No, they never do. The author stresses that bringing Moscow to the table will require an overwhelming unified application of diplomatic and economic pressure, specifically from the United States and European NATO members.
Right.
And that pressure has to be applied with absolute, uncompromising clarity. Any perception of fractured resolve in the West will just be exploited by Moscow to buy time.
Which brings us to the final narrative bridge the author builds, connecting the battlefields of Eastern Europe to the diplomatic corridors of the US and the UK. And this involves a very specific geopolitical hypothesis regarding some major global figures.
And again, we really must tread carefully here to ensure we are purely reporting the strategic calculus the author has mapped out.
Absolutely. Just to reiterate our disclaimer for you listening, we are looking at a diplomatic hypothesis presented in a May 2026 Telegraph article. We are not endorsing any political candidate, any royal figure, or prescribing any specific diplomatic action. We are simply delivering the author's analysis of the global board.
Right, so the author introduces the role of King Charles III, noting the monarch's barnstorming diplomatic trip to the United States. The author's underlying theory is that King Charles might possess the unique soft power necessary to, in the article's phrasing, talk some sense into Donald Trump on Ukraine.
Let's unpack the mechanics of why the author links those two specific figures. Donald Trump represents a political faction that has shown skepticism toward indefinite NATO funding.
Right.
Which creates a potential fracturing of Western unity, and that's exactly the kind of fracture Putin needs. King Charles represents the traditional, enduring transatlantic alliance.
Exactly. The author's hypothesis is that the deployment of historical soft power, meaning the British monarchy, might be the only lever left to ensure that American hard power and diplomatic backing remain firmly aligned with Europe. If the U.S. and European allies present a totally unified, unyielding front, it boxes Putin in completely.
It essentially removes any lingering hope the Kremlin has of outlasting Western attention spans.
And if that strict diplomatic containment holds, the author believes it might finally force the dictator in the Kremlin to accept the reality of his hollow military and engage in real, substantive negotiations to end the conflict.
But there's a catch, isn't there?
Yeah, the author issues a stark warning. This alignment represents a promising opportunity for Ukraine and its allies, but it's a highly fleeting one.
Because the window for leverage won't stay open forever. Domestic politics in Western nations shift, Election cycles disrupt momentum, and geopolitical attention invariably wanders.
It's a very precarious balancing act.
It is genuinely wild how much you can learn just by analyzing what isn't present. We started this entire analysis by looking at a single parade in Red Square, just a token event stripped of its heavy armor.
And by pulling on that one thread, the entire facade of invincibility unraveled.
Yeah, it revealed the massive structural cracks in a superpower's military capability. It led us to understand the 932-mile geographic inversion of the battlefield, the collapse of their air defense protective bubbles, the legal and social crisis of utilizing rural conscripts, and the quiet, brilliant evolution of Ukraine's future-proofed industrial strength.
It's a vital reminder that in geopolitics, the most critical intelligence isn't usually found in what a nation broadcasts to the world, but in what it desperately, actively tries to hide.
So the overarching takeaway for you listening is to always look for those missing tanks. When you're reading the news or analyzing global markets, look for the absences, the silences, and the scaled-down events.
Look past the facade.
Exactly. Pay attention to the mechanisms beneath the posturing,
Yeah.
because that is almost always where the real structural story is hiding.
This raises an important question, though, moving forward.
Yep.
One that goes far beyond just the immediate diplomatic outcome of this specific conflict.
Oh, lay it on me.
Think deeply about Ukraine's strategy of exporting their defense expertise to the Middle East right now.
Okay.
If Ukraine successfully utilizes the crucible of this horrific conflict to build a massive, battle-hardened, technologically independent defense industry,
Yeah.
how will Ukraine's new status as a major global arms manufacturer and security exporter fundamentally redraw the geopolitical and economic map of Europe after the war ends?
Wow, if they pull that off, they wouldn't just be a recovering nation dependent on Western aid. They would emerge as a primary security provider and technological hub for the entire continent.
It's huge.
That doesn't just end a war, that changes the entire balance of power in Eastern Europe.
It creates an entirely new center of gravity for decades to come.
That is absolutely a metric to keep your eye on. And the next time you see a massive stone pillar or a grand military parade on the news projecting unquestioned power, maybe give it a little mental tap.
Because it sounds hollow.
Exactly. Listen closely and see if it sounds hollow. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the missing tanks, and we will see you next time.
Make no mistake, Vladimir Putin is now afraid. May 1st, 2026. The scaling down of the May 9th Victory Day parade in Red Square is extraordinary. So much so that it demands serious attention. What was once a massive display of military power now appears reduced to something closer to a token event. This, remember, is meant to honor the sacrifice of some 26 million Russians during what they called the Great Patriotic War, known elsewhere as the Second World War. To cut it back so dramatically, reportedly due to an inability to defend Moscow from Ukrainian attack, is not just embarrassing, it is strategically revealing. For Vladimir Putin, it raises uncomfortable questions. This is in part because when Putin reintroduced military hardware to the parade in 2008, he framed it as a clear signal of strength, a warning to adversaries that Russia could defend itself. He was explicit. This was not saber-rattling, but proof of growing capability. That claim now rings hollow. There are two key issues here. First, the war in Ukraine is not going Russia's way. Russian forces are losing ground and are suffering casualties at an unsustainable rate. Replacements, poorly trained and reportedly including ethnic Russian conscripts who are not supposed to be sent beyond Russia's borders, are being fed into the fight with little effect beyond inflating losses. This reality is no longer contained. Knowledge of it is filtering back into Russia and fueling discontent. Second, Ukraine has shifted the battle space. This is no longer a conflict confined to the front lines. Ukrainian strikes are reaching deep into Russian territory at ranges up to 932 miles, targeting critical infrastructure. There are credible reports of significant damage to Russia's oil production and key air defense assets. Moscow appears unable to stop these attacks and the economic consequences are beginning to bite. Against that backdrop, the reduced parade becomes more than symbolism. It is an admission of decline. Even after redeploying advanced air defense assets like the S-400 missile system away from the front lines, the Kremlin cannot guarantee the security of its own capital. Nor does Russia appear to have sufficient modern armor left to present a convincing show of strength. The museum pieces now in service would be an embarrassment. The decision to proceed with foreign guests and civilians in attendance while limiting military display is telling. It speaks volumes to priorities and vulnerabilities in Putin's disregard for his allies and his people. Discontent is no longer confined to fringe voices. Military bloggers and even senior military officers are increasingly vocal in their criticism of how the war is being conducted, and a major crackdown on social media and other independent internet platforms is underway. Contrast that with Ukraine's position. Under Wimar Zelensky, Kyiv projects confidence, striking targets deep inside Russia while expanding its domestic production of drones and missiles. Ukraine is not just fighting the war. It is shaping the future battle space and building an industrial base that will outlast the conflict. Its experts are now in the Middle East advising and offering hardware to protect against Iranian drones and missiles. This is a smart move and will help fund the rebuilding of Ukraine after the war. The strategic picture is shifting. For Putin, the options are narrowing. A ceasefire and a negotiated settlement may now represent his least worst outcome. But that will require pressure, particularly from European NATO members, applied with clarity and resolve. And just perhaps, King Charles III on his barnstorming trip to the US has managed to talk some sense into Donald Trump on Ukraine. If so, that might also help to bring the dictator in the Kremlin to the table for real. Ukraine's allies must help Kiev exploit this promising but probably fleeting opportunity. By The Telegraph, story by Hamish de Breton Gordon, May 1, 2026.